Hey friends, I'm so glad you're here for this camera setting tutorial. I will be walking you through the different components of your camera so that you can feel confident shooting in manual and you'll be able to tackle any lighting situation that you encounter. The reason that I'm offering this is because I offer presets and I speak so much on editing, and I'm a firm believer that it all starts with a good image. Any preset can't magically fix a poor photo, so it's important to understand our camera so that we can really tackle everything in camera before we start editing. So let's talk about why it's important to shoot in manual. You have more control over the outcome of the image. You can adjust for elements that achieve your style, and you can be more creative. There are so many things that you can do in manual that your camera in auto can't do for you, so it's important to know how to utilize the tools that we have so that we can really create the best image possible. Let's start with the basics. This is going to be very basic for some of you, but maybe brand new for others. And I have to acknowledge that I'm speaking to a wide range of experience levels, so we're going to cover it all. These are the main components of your camera. It comes down to aperture, which is the opening of the lens, the shutter speed, which is how fast or slow the shutter opens and closes, ISO, which is the sensitivity of the image sensor to light, and white balance, which is correcting color cast for a naturally colored image. So finding a balance between all of these is how we create a well-exposed, in focus, and naturally colored image. So we're going to get into each one of these and talk about what that component really is about, and then some tips that I have for shooting with these settings. So aperture, again, is the opening within a lens, and we can make this opening wider or smaller. Another word for aperture is f-stop, and these numbers we see at the bottom of the scale are different f-stop sizes. We have to think about these numbers as fractions, and the number at the bottom is the denominator of the fraction. So even though 1.4 might seem like it would be smaller than 22, because it's a fraction, it's actually a larger number, so it has a wider opening. This means that we are letting in more light into our lens. And the trade-off here is that less of the image is in focus, so we have a shallow depth of field, and that means that there is more blur in the image, and we have a small slice of the atmosphere that is actually crisp and sharp. And if we move over to the right side of the scale, we are up at f22. This means that our opening is really small, and that means that there's not a lot of light being let into our camera, but that means that more of the image is in focus and we have a deep depth of field. So we have opened that plane of focus up so that we have focus throughout our entire image. So moving on to some tips I have about aperture. I have found these sweet spots as I'm shooting, and I kind of stick with those as a rule of thumb depending on the subject that I'm shooting. So I'm going to break these down for you. These aren't textbook, it's just kind of a preference thing, but I've found that they work really great for different subject material that I'm shooting. If I am shooting portraits of 1 to 2 people, which is typically what I'm shooting, my f-stop is around f1.8 to f2.2. I try to have the rule of thumb that if I'm shooting one person, I'm around f1 point something. If I'm shooting 2 people, I'm in f2 point something. If I'm shooting 3 or more people, I'm in f3 point something usually. This is so that we can have more people in focus. We are opening up that plane of focus so that no faces are blurry if they're not all on the same plane. And then detail shots, I want the detail itself to be sharp, but everything in front of and behind that to be blurred. So I am opening my aperture really wide so that I have a shallow depth of field and a small plane of focus. If we are shooting landscape photos, we want the entire landscape to be in focus. We want a deep depth of field, so we are closing down our aperture, and it's going to be a higher number like f22. So here are some examples. This is obviously 2 people, so I'm at my sweet spot of f2.0. You can see that the closer I get to them, the more drastic this range of in focus versus out of focus gets. So I really love getting close to subjects because that push and pull of focus and blur is really dynamic. So her hair is out of focus, the background's really blurry, but their faces are sharp, and it just really helps draw attention to the couple and the moment, and I just love using that feature of my aperture to be able to create something like this. And then here's another example of two people. I've backed up a little bit further so that range of focus isn't as intense, but here we have them both pretty much in focus. My focus is directly on her, so he's going to be a little bit blurred since he's coming out of that plane just slightly. And then we still have that really blurred background, which is what I want. Here we have a group of 3 or more, so I'm shooting at f3.2. I am trying to open up that plane of focus by closing down my aperture a little bit so that I have more focus range so that they can all fit in that plane and have all of their faces in focus. If they're not in a perfectly straight line, then some of them might be stepping out of that plane. So I want to make sure that it's wide enough so that they can all fit inside that and all have their faces in focus. And then here's a detail shot. I opened my aperture really wide so that that plane of focus is really narrow. So I wanted all of the attention to be on the ring and nothing else. So the antler coming towards me is completely blurred. The wall is completely blurred. I'm really close to my subject so that that range of focus is even more dynamic and all of your attention goes to that ring. So moving on to shutter speed. Shutter speed, again, is how fast or slow the shutter opens and closes, and we can control that speed. This number scale is in seconds, and on the left-hand side, we're looking at 1 second, going all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. So starting on the left, obviously 1 second is going to be a lot longer. So we have a slow exposure, which means that we are able to let in more light to our camera, and that means that the image will be brighter. Our trade-off here is that any moving subject or moving photographer will cause a blur within the image. And then moving to the right, this shutter speed is really fast. It opens and closes quickly. This means that we have a fast exposure, which is letting in less light, and that means that our image will appear darker, and any moving subject will be frozen in time because it's open for so quickly that it doesn't have a chance to read that movement. So here are some shutter speed tips. These, again, are not textbook. They're just some sweet spots that I kind of stick to as I'm shooting. Typically, I'm shooting portraits of moving people, and typically I have a decent amount of light to work with as I'm shooting outside most of the time. So this is the lowest that I will let my shutter speed go, and that's 1/320th or faster. Knowing that I am moving and they're moving a lot, I want to make sure that they're frozen in time and that they're sharp. If I'm shooting portraits of still people, I'm able to drop my shutter speed a little slower, but I won't do that unless I have to. So if I don't have a ton of light to work with, then I may drop it down to 1/200th or faster, but not much slower than that just because I am a living human being and so are they, and so there's still movement happening. And then if I'm shooting non-moving inanimate objects like detail shots, I'm shooting at 1/125th or faster. I still am probably shooting a lot faster than that if I can, but if I don't have all the light I need, then I will let it drop down that low because my subject isn't moving at all. So here's an example of a couple that's running across the street. I wanted them to be kind of frozen in time, so I had my shutter speed at 1/320th or faster. Here it's at 1/400th. In the next image, we slowed down, they're not moving, so my shutter speed was able to drop down to 1/200th. It had gotten a little bit darker and I needed a little more light to be let in, so I had them in a stiller pose so that I could have my shutter speed a little slower. So moving on to ISO, this one is probably the last one on our minds, and we only really need to think about it if it's starting to get a little bit darker, but it is helpful when we have a little bit less light to work with and we want to stick with those sweet spots that we had. It kind of comes in as a lifesaver to give us some more light that's not there. So this scale is a range of different ISOs, and on the left we have 100, on the right we're going all the way up to 12,000. A lot of cameras go a lot higher than that. The lower the number, the less sensitive your camera sensor is to light, so more natural light coming into the image is needed to make a well exposed image. The nice thing about this is we have pretty much no noise or grain because all of the light is there for us and it's not making up any artificial light. And if we're cranking our ISO way up, which we'll do in a dark situation, that makes our camera sensor more sensitive to light, so less natural light coming into our camera is needed. But our trade-off here is that it creates a lot of noise and grain because it's making up light that's not actually there. Some ISO tips. pretty simple with these. Just stay low if you have enough light to work with. I'm usually shooting at ISO 100 unless I'm shooting in a dark environment. And then in low lighting, if my sweet spots of my shutter speed or aperture are needing to drop below what I usually want them at, then I'll increase my ISO to give me a little extra light to work with so I can stay at those sweet spots and make sure that my shutter speed is as fast as I want it and my aperture is as wide as I want it. So here we're in broad daylight. I have more than enough light to work with, so my ISO is all the way down at 100. My sweet spot is there for my aperture, and I am well above my sweet spot for my shutter speed, so there's no reason for me to increase my ISO past that, which means that I have a really sharp image with no grain. And then in this situation, it was a little bit after sunset on a cloudy day, so we didn't have a ton of natural light coming in. Because I wanted to stick with my shutter speed and aperture where I wanted them, I had to crank my ISO up to 1250 here to bring in some of that artificial light so that I didn't have to drop down below my sweet spots for my aperture and shutter speed. You can see that I have a little bit of grain and noise in the image. Sometimes you just have to make that trade-off if you want to keep your other elements the same. So now moving on to white balance. This is a Kelvin scale. If we are on the left side, we are in a more yellow white balance, and if we move to the right, we are in a more blue white balance. If we are, for example, shooting in shade, our white balance should be around 8,000 Kelvin. If we are shooting candlelight, our white balance should be around 1,000 Kelvin. So it's going to compensate for what's there, and it's going to add yellow if you are shooting in a blue environment, or add blue if you're shooting in a yellow environment. So some tips for white balance. This is totally a personal preference. I prefer not to shoot in Kelvin anymore. I used to, and I ran into myself shooting too warm because that's kind of what I preferred, and it was too warm once I started editing. And then my images and my second shooter's images always looked different. So I switched to auto white balance, but I found that my camera was making everything a little bit blue magenta, and I kind of preferred a warmer greener tint. So I have a little secret to let you in on for adjusting white balance so that it's exactly how you want it, and we'll get into that right after this. But if I am in a really tricky lighting situation and my white balance just isn't cutting it, or I want a really specific color for some reason, then I will use Kelvin for that. So it's important to understand how it works, but for consistency purposes, I stick with auto white balance because I'm always moving and always going from indoor to outdoor, changing rooms within a wedding. So it is reading the situation for me, and it's just one less thing I have to worry about, and I find that it nails it pretty well. This is an example of white balance shift. So on the left, we have the image auto white balance, and in my opinion, it's a little blue and magenta. His skin just looks a little red to me. And on the right, I did a white balance shift, so I added a little bit of warmth and green to my white balance in camera, and this is how it came out. This is my handsome husband, Tommy, by the way, and I'm thankful that he is willing to get in front of my camera for stuff like this, but I'm going to show you how to do that in your camera. On the left, we have the main menu, and you're going to click on white balance shift / bracket, and it will normally be set at 0. It's going to take you to this screen on the right. What I do is I go towards the A 2 spaces, and I go towards the green up 2 spaces. And it will be set at A2 G2, which means that it is adding a little bit of yellow and a little bit of green. If your preference is a little bit of blue and a little bit of magenta, or a little bit of yellow and a little bit of magenta, you might just find a spot that works best for you. But this has been something that has been so helpful for me, and every time I have a second shooter set their camera to this, they end up sticking with it because they just think it makes such a big difference. So try it out and see what works best for your style, but it's just a helpful tool to have, and it takes out the guesswork of shooting in Kelvin. So moving on to flash. This is something that a lot of people kind of forget about and don't really take the time to learn. I am not a master of flash, and I don't use it very often, but I think it's important to know the basics of how your flash works. You can be shooting in ETTL, which is basically auto for flash, or you can be shooting in manual. It's really helpful to shoot in manual for the same reasons that it's helpful to shoot in manual on your camera. The main elements that you are changing with your flash in manual are the power and the zoom, the main thing being the power. The larger the number will have more brightness, so 1/1, 1/2 is going to be really bright, it has more power. The smaller the fraction, the less power and less brightness that is getting put out. Then moving on to zoom, this is the range that your flash is providing light, so it's kind of matching whatever lens you're using. So if you are using a wide lens, there's a wide range of flash, and if you're using a narrow lens or a zoom lens, there's a narrow range of flash. It basically comes down to two main ways that we use flash: direct flash or bounced flash. If we are using direct flash, we are shining the light directly at our subject. That means that we need a lower power because the light is going straight at them. And if we're using a bounced flash, we are angling our flash so that it can bounce off of a ceiling or a wall or a card. So we need a higher power because the flash has to reflect off of something else and then fall on our subject. So here's an example of bounced flash versus direct flash. You can see that they give totally different looks. This is in the same space at the same wedding. My choice on what kind of flash to use was determined by what is going on during the wedding. It's all based off of environment and the action that is taking place. On the left, they are slow dancing for their first dance, so I want it to be more of a natural looking image, and I am bouncing my flash off of the wall behind me. In the right one, they are dancing with the DJ, so I want it to be more of a dark environment and look like it is a dark dance floor. I'm using a direct flash to make it a little less formal. So how do we decide when to use flash versus a high ISO? This comes down to preference. For me, I tend to prefer a high ISO over flash in most cases, but there are times that I choose flash over high ISO, and these are kind of some of the questions that I ask myself when I'm deciding if I need a flash. So the first question is there enough ambient light? If there is some light to work with, then I will do my best to use that. If there is not a lot of light to work with and I'm shooting in the dark, then I'm not going to try so hard to crank my ISO up that is becoming super noisy. I'd rather use flash and get a technically correct image. The second question is my camera capable of a very high ISO? Certain cameras can be pushed a lot further than others and can pull off a higher ISO, so it's important to know your camera well and know what that threshold is for your camera. Is there a lot of movement? If I have a ton of movement going on that I'm capturing and it's really dark, it's really tricky to capture that movement without cranking your ISO up super high so that you can keep your shutter speed up. So you might want to use flash if people are moving a lot and you're not able to capture it clearly. Is the ambient light something I can color balance? Sometimes we're working with candle light or tungsten light and it creates a really warm cast on everything. If it's so warm and distracting that you're going to have to turn everything into black and white later, I might just tend to use flash so that I can get everything looking natural and I can make sure people's skin tones are correct, and that way I'm saving myself time later in editing as well. And then finally, what is more important to you and your client, mood or technically correct? And this comes back to personal preference and your personal style and the style of the wedding. Some weddings just fit that flash look better and it makes more sense to capture everything technically correct. And then some weddings are more focused on the mood and the atmosphere, and you might want to showcase that by shooting with a high ISO. So I sent out a poll on Instagram and asked what situations you guys find the trickiest to shoot in, and these were by far the top ones. I am going to break these down and talk about the settings I use in each of these situations. So you guys mentioned low lighting and low lighting with movement, dancing, sparkler exits, and harsh sun or harsh light. So low lighting, like I said before, it's really important to know your ISO threshold and how far you can push that. Be okay with underexposing. It's so much better to underexpose a little bit and bring that up when you are editing than to try to get all of that artificial light in your camera when it's not there, because you're going to sacrifice something and give yourself a lot of noise or a lot of blur. And then inform your clients. I tell my brides before their weddings that the more more outdoor lighting or the more candles or anything like that that they can help bring light into a dark reception, the better, so that I can not use flash for as long as possible and use that ambient light to really showcase the atmosphere. But it's just important for them to be aware of this because a lot of brides might not think about that. Just having your clients on the same page as you. So in this shot, I was at ISO 3200. I opened up my aperture a little bit so that I could let in a little more light, and I'm far enough away from my subjects that I'm not having that dynamic shift of focus and blur. I dropped my shutter speed just a little bit so that I could let in some more light, and I was okay with this because my subjects weren't really moving and I was being conscious of being still. I pushed my sweet spots just a tiny bit so that I didn't have to crank my ISO up too high, but I also underexposed, and if you saw the before of this image, you'll see that it's a lot darker, and then I just increased the exposure when I was editing. So low lighting with movement is kind of a different story. Your shutter speed becomes your top priority. So we want to increase our ISO, maybe open up our aperture before we decrease our shutter speed, and be okay with underexposing, even if it's by a lot. And then again, inform your clients. Tell them, can you run slow-mo towards me because I'm going to be shooting a little bit slower since we don't have a lot of light to work with. So here I'm shooting again at ISO 3200. I have my f-stop at 2.0 and I kept my shutter speed at my sweet spot so that they're not blurred as they're running towards me. So on to dancing, focusing on the DJ fast dancing that we have at receptions. This is totally a preference thing, but I always shoot with a dragged shutter, and this is how we create that look of the streaks in the image from the lights. To me, if I'm shooting with direct flash or bounced flash, it kind of looks like a deer caught in headlights, and it's just a weird thing seeing sweaty people that are moving, and then it's just this bright dance floor, so it just feels kind of out of place. So this is the way I like to shoot, and this is how I achieve that. I make my aperture really small, so here I'm at f11. The reason I do this is because if I was shooting at a wide aperture, I would have a shallow depth of field, so all those little streaks in the background would be big blurry streaks. So I want to make sure that those little lights are small and in focus so that their streaks are just little lines. I am having a slower shutter, so here I'm at 1/4 of a second. That is so that I have time to move my camera and I can record that movement, which is creating that streak of light. I am shooting with a direct flash and I'm shooting in manual focus. So I take one image and get the focus, and then I switch it to manual so that it is quickly focusing. I direct my camera at my subject and the flash will go off, and then I will shake my camera around, and then you see these streaks of light. And deciding what power of flash I'm using and what ISO I'm at is kind of a test and see what works. So I will shoot something, and if it's a little too bright, I will turn my ISO down, or I will turn the power of my flash down until it looks properly exposed. And then a sparkler exit. I choose to shoot with no flash during a sparkler exit, and I highly recommend this. It just has so much more atmosphere and mood when you are able to shoot without a flash. So there are some tips for shooting without a flash during a sparkler exit. The first thing is to wait for the smoke to build up. That will allow light to be reflected off of the smoke so that you have more ambient light to work with. I test my settings first on my second shooter or one of the guests so that I am ready when they start running towards me. I use a high ISO to compensate for not using a flash, and then I turn my AF assist on my flash so that it is sending out a beam of light so that my camera can focus, but my flash is set to not fire. And then finally, again, instruct your clients. So I tell my clients to jog slowly and then to stop several times and kiss so that I have several chances to catch them in focus. So here I'm shooting at ISO 3200. I still have my f-stop at my sweet spot of 2.0, and then my shutter speed is pushed a little bit past my sweet spot, but because they're stopping so many times, I'm able to go down to 1/200th just to let in a little bit more light. And lastly, harsh light. So the first tip is to try to avoid shooting in harsh light if you can. I prefer shooting at sunset or sunrise, but I recognize that a lot of times we don't have those options. So how do we make it work if we are stuck shooting midday? my first tip is to try to find shade or something that can diffuse the light for you and make it a little softer. So if I can find a large patch of shade, I will use that and have my couple completely in the shade. If I don't have that option, then I will maybe try to find a tree or something that the light can come through so that it's not so harsh. I will turn my client so that they are backlit. Typically, the sun will be at some sort of an angle, so try to find that angle and have that coming from behind the client and towards your camera. This will help avoid any harsh light falling on their face. And then try to find a natural reflector. So maybe you can put them on a concrete path or some sand and use that so that the light can bounce back up and illuminate the side of the face that's in shadow. And then exposed for skin. So a lot of times there are so many factors coming into our camera and our light meter is going crazy when we're shooting in harsh light, and it might be tempting to just expose based off of what our light meter says or off of another element in the image. But I just always want to look at what my client's skin is looking like, so I don't even use my light meter and I just take a shot and see what that looks like in camera and underexpose just a tad to save some of the highlights in the image so that they're not completely blown out. And then if you are shooting with the sun falling directly on their face and you are angling them towards the light, then you want to make sure to position their faces so that they're angled with flattering shadows. So you want their chins typically to be pointed upwards towards the light, and this makes sure that there's not shadows falling below their eyes and below their nose, below their chins, and this is just a more flattering look. So for this image, I'm shooting at ISO 100 and I'm at my sweet spot of f2.0, and then my shutter speed's all the way up at 1/2000, and I just do my best to work with what I've got when I've got harsh light to tackle. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. I hope that after this you can leave feeling more confident shooting in manual and tackling those tricky lighting situations. Leave me some feedback and let me know if this was helpful for you, and I hope that you are leaving feeling great about using your camera.